Well, good morning. It is time for us to begin our class today. Give you a moment to get poised. Let's have a word of opening prayer together. Dear Heavenly Father, we offer our thanksgiving that we have opportunity to be in this place today in your presence. As we look into your word, we ask for wisdom that we would be able to use the things that we learn in a way that would not only make us better servants, but also better teachers of your word. We ask that you be with those who cannot be with us today, those that are at home that are viewing with us, and that we might encourage them and be a help to them along the way as well. Help us now in this time and help us be faithful in your service. In Christ's name, amen. We pick up again in verse 17 of Acts chapter 24 this morning. And it says, "Now after many years I came to bring alms and offering to my nation." This was Paul's reply to the third charge of that of profaning the temple. And of course, alms refers to what? Gift. Money, and it may be that he's referring to the money that he brought from the Gentile Christians to the poor saints in Jerusalem. That might be what he's referring to. Or it might be something else that we're not particularly aware of. Offerings, of course, were customary at the temple. That's one of the things you did when you went there. And also remember, he was covering the expenses for those 4 men who had vows. And I don't know if you've ever looked into what all that entailed, but it was quite a bit. There was a lamb for a sin offering. Another was a burnt offering. There was a ram for another sacrifice. There was a meal offering. There were drink offerings. It was very extensive. And so there was quite a cost involved in fulfilling those vows. Now, in verse 18 it goes on to say, "In the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me, purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult." What is involved in purification? Does anybody offhand know about that? Well, one of the things involved was a ceremonial washing in what they call living waters. Now, by living waters, they meant waters from a stream that was running, a running stream or a spring, not from a stagnant pool, a lake or something like that, or a pond. And they would wash in that, and I guess there was a ceremonial way they went about that. And then, of course, afterwards they put on clean clothes. That was part of the purification process. Now, the 4 men likely had a Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow had a lot of restrictions about not eating grapes, having anything to do with a grape in any form, shape, or fashion, and other restrictions. And it lasted at least 30 days. Sometimes it lasted for years. But at least 30 days if you took a Nazirite vow. At the end of which, you were purified, you went to the temple, you made all these offerings, and you were allowed to shave your head as a completion of that vow. Now, Paul did not have a vow at this time. You remember, he had a vow when he went to Caesarea. He had to fulfill a vow that he had made there. But he did not have a vow at this time, but he was told to purify himself with them to go into the temple. And what would be the reason that Paul would need to purify himself? That's right. That's exactly right. He had had contact with the Gentiles, been in their cities, traveling among them, and eating with them probably. which was also a prohibitive thing. That was a defiling thing. And so that was probably his reason. Now, this is how the Jews from Asia found him in the temple, engaged in a Jewish rite. Now, when you went to the temple to do this wasn't something you just did all by yourself. There was supervision. The priests there in the temple were there to oversee all of these things, right? And so Paul was crystal clear in what he was doing when the Jews from Asia came in. And I think that's an important thing to know. And so he goes on to say, they ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. They ought to be the ones. Now, they weren't there. The Jews from Asia were not there in front of Felix in Caesarea to do that. But they should have been the ones, because Paul had no issue at all until they got to Jerusalem, right? When Paul was in Jerusalem, everything was fine. He went in the temple. He was allowed to go in the temple. He purified himself. He paid the expenses for those men to fulfill their vow. And that was under the approval of the priests that were there. There was no disturbance in the city by his presence until the Jews from Asia got there. And they're the ones that caused the trouble. They were the ones that should have something to say against him, rather than the Sadducees and the elders and all that were there and present at the time. So those from the Jewish hierarchy that came to accuse him had no first-hand knowledge of wrongdoing and relied on hearsay and contrived charges. Anything else they might have had? That was it, wasn't it? Hearsay and contrived charges was all they had, and of course they went overboard with it, because there was a hatred for Christians in general, and Paul in particular, because Paul is a traitor. Paul's a turncoat. And you always want to be sure you get those. Any comments from anyone so far? Okay. And then verse 20 says, or else that those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. So now he's putting Ananias and the elders on the spot to prove their accusations, or to admit the council had no evidence. So they've either got to make up something and call it proof, or lie about it, or admit that, well, he's... As far as we know, there was no response from those folks, was it? Apparently they just kept quiet when Paul said that to them. That quieted them down pretty completely. Yeah.
Remember, these are pretty much the same men that he already went before when the commander in Jerusalem brought Paul before them to see what was going on, and that caused another riot, basically, at the council. So these are the same men that Paul sat before earlier on.
Oh, yes.
And now he's saying, okay, I've already been before you. You didn't bring up anything. The commander saw through you. That's why he wrote the letter and sent me here.
Yeah.
To get a fairer trial, and now you're here before me again. So if you have something, bring it up. And of course they didn't.
Of course not. Well, this is going to get a lot more interesting in just a minute. Now, Paul does admit one thing that they're mad about. In verse 21, he says, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. Paul is sticking by his guns. He preaches the resurrection of the dead, both just and unjust, and truth cannot be denied. In the eyes of the high priests and Sadducees, this was Paul's real offense. Because remember, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. The riot that was caused by his statement was between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because the Pharisees agreed with him. But the Sadducees, who happened to be a little bit more in power at the time, disagreed with him. It made them furious. Anything else from y'all? Yes, Harrison?
Could they, or most of them, some of them are like you said, be going against Paul just because he was preaching and didn't believe what they believed. He wasn't going with what they believed. He was preaching the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. That's what the Sadducees and Ananias happened to be a Sadducee, by the way. The high priest that year was a Sadducee. And so, yes, they would be furious about that. So they didn't.
It's common sense. You might believe one thing about something, I believe another thing, but that ain't no reason for me to try to destroy you or whatever. That's no reason.
If you're a reasonable person.
Well, yeah, that's true too. I mean, yeah, that has, but when I'm kind of getting at, they're just going against him because he didn't believe what they believe. Well, that's no reason, really.
No, it's not. But again, that's a reasonable person's thinking. These people are not reasonable. These people, if they admit, it's one thing if you're going down the street and you miss a turn and you're only one block from your, you say, oh, I missed my turn, I'll go back and catch it. If you missed your turn and you're now 20 miles down the road and somebody mentioned it to you, that really galls you. And so these people have believed this all their lives, and they've been wrong all their lives. And if you see somebody that's been wrong a long time, that really stings to admit, I've been an idiot for 50 years. I've been wrong for 50 years, and the truth was right in front of me the whole time. It's amazing the Sadducees still believed in this thing because Jesus has been resurrected in front of their very eyes. At the time of Jesus' death, the graves opened up and dead people were resurrected and walked through the whole city of Jerusalem. Lazarus was raised from the dead. You'd think they'd begin to catch on by now. But these are very stubborn, strong-willed people who, I'm right and that's all there is to it, don't mess with the facts. Deborah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think you said basically what I would have said.
Okay.
Just remember Jesus, he came first.
Yeah. But again, that's, and we see that today. Yes.
I'm amazed.
I thought you would be. I thought you surely would be, yes. And so that's the real thing they're mad about. They don't have any proof that he's done anything wrong. And really, this is not anything wrong. It's just that it contradicts their stand, and they don't want to come off of their stand. And so they want to get rid of Paul. And again, there's still this thing that Paul once was one of them persecuting Christians. They have a hatred for Christians. And Paul has betrayed them because he left.
Yeah, but this is proof positive that Jesus was the Christ. Is they still hate him 2,000 years ago?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sure.
You can't generate that just because they dislike you.
Yeah. Now, verse 22, but when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. Now, Felix has some insight into Christianity. He's been in this area for a while. He knows what the struggles are. He knows a little bit about it. We'll talk about his wife a little bit more. His wife is a Jew, and she, of course, will know something about Christians, and he can learn from her, and we'll get into why that is in just a minute. But he puts off a decision, and his excuse is he's going to wait for Lysias to come. Now, he's already got Lysias' letter. He's got all he needs to know in the letter. But it's an excuse to not make a choice right now. He's buying time. He's looking for a way not to make a decision, so this is his excuse. And you see that a lot. So that's where they are. And so then he says he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him. So Paul is now put under the supervision of a centurion. Now, a centurion is a fairly high-ranking individual. Centurion means he had at least 100 men under his command. And this is kind of unique for Paul, because usually in this type of imprisonment, the prisoner was bound to just a plain soldier. And Paul has been in the past, if you remember, has been bound to a soldier. This time as centurion, he's not bound to him. The centurion just has oversight over him. And he has liberty. His friends can come and visit him. They can bring him stuff, whatever he needs, provide for him. So now, I think there's a reason for this that we're going to back up here a little bit, and I'll give you some background as to why I think Felix is a little bit kind to Paul in a way. He's also, of course, not wanting to get himself in trouble either way either, but he can't quite let him go. But on the other hand, he realizes that he's not guilty of anything. Now, Paul was held because the Jews would be offended if he was turned loose. And that's the last thing that Felix wanted, was the Jews to be offended, mad at him. Later on, we'll see that they really did, and that's why he was removed from his position. It was because of multiple charges of offense that were brought against him. He was moved from that place and put in another location. And so he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be, and also he kind of, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but he was kind of looking, I believe, for a bribe. Now later on, it flat states he was looking for a bribe. But we'll find out that Felix was the kind of guy that was always looking for a bribe. And he thought, well, maybe the Christians would come together and put a little pot together and offer to, me to let him go. And if it's enough, well, we'll take a chance on it. But that didn't happen. But not freeing Paul did what? In the grand scheme of things, saved his life. It kept him alive. Because all the Jews wanted to do with him was what? One thing. Kill him. That's all they wanted. Paul did. Paul gets loose, that's the first thing they're going to try to do, is kill him. And so, here then, in a backhanded way, life is now preserved by this. Now, that wasn't a conscious effort on the part of anybody, but that was the way it worked out prophetically, but he is now preserved.
Seems like that verse, all things work together for good for them that love the Lord.
Apparently, yes. Yeah, that ought to be
It's almost like it worked.
There ought to be a song like that.
Yeah, there should be.
Yeah.
I agree.
Greg.
You talked about he wouldn't release Paul because the Jews would be upset. The Jews, especially the council, the high priest, the council, they were very adept at using veiled, threats against Roman rulers. If you go back to Jesus' trial, Pontius Pilate, because he didn't want to do anything with Jesus, but then they got to the point and said, he's saying he's a king and you're not going to do anything, you're not Caesar's friend. And so that's a veiled threat saying, look, if you don't do something, we're going to go tell Caesar that you're not holding your allegiance to him.
Yeah.
There's another king here that you're putting your allegiance to. And after they said that to Pontius Pilate, that's when he washed his hands and said, go ahead and take care of it.
Yeah. Well, as I say, that these fellows are under pressure not to have big disturbances.
Right.
That was the Roman thing, is that we want things peaceful, we want the money coming in to Rome in taxes. That's the two big things they wanted.
Yeah, order. Yeah,
Order.
They were really hard on that which was not orderly. It was like it was a fetish with them or something.
Now, verse 24. Now it starts to get interesting. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. This is a good time to explain just who these people were. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Felix that we didn't talk about before. Felix is now the Roman governor of Judea. Nationally, he was a Greek. He was not a Roman, but originally he was a slave in Cilicia. That's how Felix started out. He was a slave. And guess where Paul was from? Remember Acts 22:31? Paul said, I am from Tarsus in Cilicia. So these two fellows, all of a sudden he looks and said, wait a minute, we're from the same place. So there's a little bit of connection just by that Felix had. And so that may have jaded his thinking just a little bit too. He says, I was a slave and I wasn't treated too well as a slave, and here Paul's not being treated too well, and we're from the same place. Maybe I should be a little bit easy with him, fellow countryman and all of that. And then he goes on. The reason he's not a slave now was Felix's brother was a freedman and a treasurer for Emperor Claudius. And so by that connection, his influence freed Felix and got him a position of authority. Now we have to go to secular history and the Romans, Tacitus and other places to read about this. But Felix then served as governor of Judea from AD 52 to AD 60. He had a reputation for corruption, cruelty, and lust.
The big three.
That's contrary to 24:2 when this lawyer for the Jews came and gave him all this flowery thank you for the peace we enjoy and all of that, how nice it is. Remember that? It says, peace and prosperity brought to this nation by your foresight. That's a bunch of junk. This fellow's known for all kind of illegal, illegitimate tactics. And so the Roman historian Tacitus said, quote, he has the power of a king but the mind of a slave. And so contrary to what 24:2 was said, his rule was marked with internal feuds and disturbances which were put down severely. Now, Drusilla was Felix's second wife. He had three. The first two were named Drusilla. Drusilla left her husband. She was married at age 14 to Azias, king of Emesa, E-M-E-S-A. And she left him to enter an illegitimate marriage with Felix. She was very beautiful, and that's, of course, the big thing. Guess who she was the daughter of? Herod Agrippa. Remember the one that was eaten by worms because he persecuted Christians, and they said the voice of a God, and he didn't correct them, and the angel of the Lord struck him, and he was eaten by worms and died? That's her daddy. Does she know something about Christians? I think she does. I think she knows a little bit about it. Now, guess who her brother and sister are? King Agrippa and Bernice, who are going to come down later. That's Drusilla's brother and sister.
Real crew, isn't it?
Yeah, so now we got a real nice family situation. Now the relationship between Agrippa and Bernice was thought to be incestuous. Because she was married around with several individuals as well. But so this is the group that we've pulled together here. We got Festus, former slave, who by a little bit of sleight of hand got out of slavery, got him a good position, has been in it for gain. Most Roman governors were in it for the gain they could get. Already, anytime ready to take a bribe, they could get one. And his wife that he stole from somebody else is the daughter of Herod Agrippa, and then her brother and sister are Agrippa and Bernice. Now, this assembly of royalty is brought Paul to hear them concerning the faith in Christ. Now, instead of an explanation of doctrine, what does Paul do? In verse 25, Now he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. That wasn't what they thought they were going to hear, is it?
That's what they needed to hear.
That's what they needed to hear. Is he stepping on toes here with this group? He's mashing them all over the place. Because, and then he says, Felix was afraid. I wonder why. I wonder why. Because he's hit him on every score. And he answered, now he didn't say shut up. He says, go away now. When I got a more convenient time, I'll call for you. He kind of downplayed a little bit, not to act like he was afraid. Just say, well, just go away. I'll talk to you later about that. You know, that's enough. And that's what he did. But Paul had reasoned about the life that ought to be lived, and that was obviously contrary to those that were listening to him. When he spoke of righteousness, he was speaking to a judge who held his office only for the sake of gain and who took bribes on a regular basis. So righteousness would be a hard point to hear about. When he spoke of self-control or temperance, he rebuked the unbridled sway of passions and of lust that they all participated in. When he spoke of judgment, he pictured the judgment scene when the just and unjust and impure of the earth would be called to account. And that frightened Felix because he was corrupt on all points. And the way he dismissed him, as I said, was just an attempt to hide that fear. Go away now, you know, when I got a convenient time. Now, he kept contact with Paul. Verse 26 says, meanwhile, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him the more often and conversed with him. Notice, though, it doesn't say that there was anybody else around. He didn't get in a situation where there was an open court to hear Paul anymore. Anytime he brought Paul in, it was just a one-to-one, and we don't know what they talked about or tried to talk about. Paul, of course, would be trying to preach to him anytime he could. That was his way. But he didn't risk the whole world hearing what Paul wanted to say in an open venue anymore. Now, why would Paul not give him a bribe?
Why would he?
What if it would get him freed? What does Paul know? Now remember, Paul. What is Paul's background? Does Paul know anything about the old law? Okay. Who is he taught by? Okay. Gamaliel is ranked as number 2 of the Jewish scholars of the law behind Hillel. Best I can remember. So Paul was well schooled in the old law. And Paul was not an ignorant individual. He was a smart man. And he probably remembered Exodus 23:8. Might want to turn there just a minute. And he'd probably know this. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. And so knowing that, Paul said, I'm not going to help you by giving you a bribe. I'm not going to help you not discern the righteous words. I'm not going to help you do this. I'm not going to work on my end to help you do wrong. You're not getting a bribe from me.
Of course, it may not have had money.
May not. May not. We don't know. Paul talks about, there were times when he was in need and times when he wasn't, and he made his living as a tent maker. We don't know. He had a sister, and we don't know a whole lot about his family and what their holdings might have been. They had enough money to send him to Jerusalem to be educated. They had that much. And so we don't know. Obviously, Paul, when he became a Christian and began preaching, gave up a lot that he had in the past. He said, I don't. My status and position was nothing, and that may have meant that whatever fortune he had, he just let it go too, quite possibly. Yes, ma'am.
And also, Paul was told by God that he was going to have to go to Rome
Yes.
to talk about God.
And so we're beginning to get around to that. Now, in verse 27, after 2 years, so now we're at AD 60, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Now these complaints have come up. Felix is going to be pulled from this position, stuck somewhere else, because remember, his brother's still influential back at the capital. But he can't stay there because everybody's mad at him and all these charges are coming up, and so they bring somebody else in. There are severe accusations from the Jews, historians say. And so he, to avoid further complaints, he kept Paul as a prisoner. Now, according to Josephus, Festus was somewhat more upright than most Roman governors. And I say somewhat because he's not squeaky clean, but he's not quite as low down as Felix was in that regard. Any thoughts or comments as we finish out that chapter? Well, we got a little time left. We might as well.
One of the things is people act like today is so much different than it was 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. It's that the human beings are still just act like human beings.
Strange how they do that, yeah.
I mean,
Must be something in the genetics.
The motivations are pretty much the same, period.
Well, and just that last line, even though he knew the Jews didn't have any ground for Paul to be persecuted or kept in jail or house arrest or any of that, it said, desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. So here he's still playing the politician.
Yep.
He wants to go out on a good note.
Okay. He never found a convenient time. We always wondered, did any of Paul's efforts ever have any sway? But the answer was absolutely not. And again, this is Roman history, but he later on hired a bunch of thugs to go murder a guy who was coming out of the temple at the time, and he got off scot-free because of the influence that he had with the Roman authorities. And he ultimately, they believe, died of tuberculosis. A lot of Romans died of TB, and that was probably what they think killed Felix. So that's kind of how he ended up. Now Festus comes into office. Festus only lived 2 years after he got in office. We're not told that right off the bat, but that's all he lived. He didn't last very long. And so after 3 days, he decides to go up to Jerusalem. Well, after all, that's the headquarters of the people I'm overseeing here. Caesarea is my capital, but the Jews' capital is still Jerusalem, so he goes up there. And the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him. After 2 years, they hadn't given it up. The men that had given an oath they would not eat or drink until they killed Paul, what do you think has happened to them?
They've gotten awful thirsty.
Well, I thought that too, and I came across something that I did not ever know before. There was a Jewish rite that the priest could give you to let you out of an oath. And it has a special name, which I did not write down. But I thought they either had to be liars and break their oath and be condemned for that, or they had to drop dead from not eating, and that may have happened. But there is a provision that the Jews made for someone to be released from an oath under certain conditions.
So an oath is just sort of an oath.
Yeah, it's sort of a I maybe will type of thing with these folks. So this whole thing, it gets to be very involved, and there's a lot of background stuff that starts coming out that you really say, okay, when I begin to see now why some of these things work like that. So the Jews are still mad. The high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in an ambush along the road to kill him. They must have had this ambush spot really fixed up by now. They must have had barbed wire and concertina wire and sandbag emplacements and everything else ready for this by now, because they must have really have a campsite dug out to do this. But that's still their plan. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. Same thing over and over again, same scenario. If you got anything, just come on down to and we'll go through the process, and you can present your case, and and of course, same situation is going to occur over and over again. But notice the governors have this format they work. This is the way we do it. You come down and you stand before me and you present your case, and we'll hear the other side, and then we'll make a decision. That was the Roman way. And each governor has almost the same speech. Almost the same speech memorized to come down and do this. And when he remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And sure enough, the Jews came again. Now, how far is this travel? How many miles about? Between the two? I don't know exactly. But it's better than a day's walk, isn't it? Don't you have to camp out along the way to get there? I mean, isn't it far enough that you can't get there in a day walking? I don't know. I always thought Paul went down there on horseback, and this is just my thinking. I wonder if Paul had ever been on a horse before. How many of you have ridden a horse? Quite a few. Okay. Have you ridden one all night?
Oh, goodness.
Have you ridden one for like 30, 35 miles? I don't imagine you feel too good after you ride that far and get off one. And that's something that at the time we just say you take him by horseback and we kind of pass it off. But I don't imagine Paul was in very good condition when he got there. Now they may have gotten off and walked him a ways and then got back on, but still, that's a long way to go on horseback. And if you're not accustomed to riding at all, that's even worse. And I suppose not many people other than Roman soldiers rode horses. That wasn't a common thing. The Jewish army certainly didn't ride horses into battle. And so that was just something I always wondered about. And so they bring him down again. And the Jews who come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Now, Paul has said this, I can't remember how many times this is now. Over and over. Same, defense, he says, where's the evidence? I don't know if they had a penalty for lying, but his accusers have lied so much that you'd think that the Jews would be wanting to put them in jail. But they haven't. And I don't know what kind of proof they could bring up except their word that he did something. Today we have all this evidence we bring in. We bring in, here's the weapon they use, and here's the blood test, and here's the DNA, and here's all of this kind of stuff. Here's the papers that they signed, and here's a case of money that they took. We have all this that we use in court. They didn't have any of this kind of stuff. It was just two sides speaking against each other. It was about the only thing they had. Unless, and again, it's just who had the most veracity. And of course, obviously, the Jews didn't have it, because Paul hasn't been executed yet or anything like that. So he answered to get that, and then Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor. See, they're still wanting to do the Jews a favor, because obviously I want my people I'm ruling over to be peaceful and not be stirred up. And says, would you go to Jerusalem and be judged? So that's what they asked him. He said, would you go there and be judged of these things? And Paul says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For I am an offender. If I am an offender of committing anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me. No one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. This is the big moment. I appeal to Caesar. And then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. This is a standard proclamation. This is not just a off-the-cuff words. It's you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. That's the bang. That's the standard wording for this to happen. And so now Paul is going to go to Rome.
And he gets to wash his hands and thing.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what he wanted to be.
Everybody so far has just kind of passed Paul along. Have you noticed that? He just, everybody says they've done the Pontius Pilate. They washed their hands of him and moved him on, moved him on, and moved him on, and moved him on. Now we're going to send him to Caesar, and he'll take care of it. It's
an all expense paid trip.
All expense paid trip. Absolutely.
Pick up the tab on this.
Absolutely. And so Paul's going to get to go to Rome. That was the plan in the first place. I mean, that was God's plan for him to get there. It's just that all these people, not knowing they were participating in that plan, did so. None of these people had a clue that they were trying to do what was intended for Paul to have done to get him to Rome. But they did.
Well, that's one of those proof. The question is, can God orchestrate? I said, yes.
Okay.
It's a symphony when you start looking at it.
But if you look, just like Sandy said about God's providence and his plan, even though he was imprisoned and or taken into custody, it never changed his outlook. We just have the gospel meaning about attitude and outlook and all that. His outlook was the same. We learned earlier that while he was up with Lysias, he was speaking to the imperial guard, and some of those of the imperial guard started to be, seemed to be converting to Christianity. And, he's talking to the rulers, Felix and then Festus. And we'll read later on when he goes up into Rome, some of Caesar's own household gets to hear the gospel. So the gospel is being preached no matter what. He has not changed his outlook one iota. He has kept going no matter what his physical circumstances were.
Yep.
Well, being blinded on the way to Damascus by the Lord would change your mind. It really would.
It certainly should.
It would sear into your memory what you were supposed to be about.
I think it would make a lasting impression on you. I think it'd make a lasting impression on you, yeah. I think just the fact you could hear the voice of God ought to be enough, whether you can see or not.
I don't know that I'm stressed for that.
No, I don't know. About time to quit, but I want to bring this up. After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. Now remember who they are. And now they had their henchman there. See, they had their sister's husband there, and now he's been removed. So now they got to go up and butter up this fella, so we're getting good with him. See. So you see how all this interplay between these people. They're all as corrupt as they can be. They have absolutely no moral standard whatsoever. They're in it for what they can get out of it, for all the gain and all the pleasure they can get at any cost.
They're not bound by the law.
No, not really, not really. And like I say, if even at the level of the Caesar himself, there can be collusion to get Festus out of being a slave by the treasurer, something went along there. Even then. So the whole government of Rome is corrupt from top to bottom. Surprise.
Yeah.
Surprise.
And they're going to wind up with Nero, so I mean, it gets worse from here.
Yeah. And of course, they said, there's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. Just kind of wonder what's going on with that. See, they're looking for a bribe too. See, okay. Our time is up. Let's stop here. We'll call ourselves stopping at verse 13, for lack of a better thing. And I appreciate your attention this morning. And thank you for putting up with me.